Hello, everybody. Welcome to the June 17th, 2020 edition of API Machinery SIG meeting. Fetty can't join us today, so you'll have to put up with me. There's 3 items on our agenda, and I think at least the second one could take a fair amount of time. So let's get started. Micah, I see you on the call. Do you want to introduce the topic?
Yeah, so this was opened by somebody else, but this is something like I wanted to bring up for discussion here that I think we'd like to see. Basically, it'd be great if there was a listener on the API server that just served healthz that didn't have auth and auth on it. The main thinking just being, if you're operating a load balancer, cloud load balancer in front of API server, and you don't want to rely on you want to mitigate the fact if someone removes the public info viewer role binding, that healthz can always be hit by the cloud load balancer or some other process like on API server that needs to validate the API server's health. It's more just like we could put, you could put some proxy process that always has authorization and authentication to call healthz, but that requires running one more process, and everyone's going to do it a different way. So this is yeah. That's kind of what I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, some background context is we have this insecure port that serves on HTTP, and we are in the process or have gotten rid of. I think we're getting rid of it very soon if it's still in.
Last I tried hacked local cluster it was in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think it's gone quite yet, but
yeah.
So after that goes away, you'll need to go through the HTTPS port. So the request is a separate port specifically and only for serving health information.
Sort of argument apply to metrics?
So people have tried. I mean, the idea, it's questionable whether someone who expressed an intent to enforce security policy for their endpoints would appreciate us providing a way to bypass that. There are mechanisms today where it is possible, if you need HTTP, to just create a process that does serve it on HTTP and always be sure that you have access. The complication in having an additional port is real. We've had problems in the past with our HTTP port not matching what the HTTPS one does. So it's not a zero cost thing for us to bear.
Yeah, I also wonder, are there load balancers that are willing to get the health information from a different port from the one that they're distributing to?
There are, actually. GCP does.
Okay.
Yeah, because we built the shim. Right?
AWS does.
Okay. Yeah, I know there's at least one. I think it might be the AWS one. There's at least one that sends a TCP request and then hangs up after it gets a response. And that causes Kubernetes to print a log warning, and people complain about that.
Yeah, that's the older load balancer if you just do TCP health checks. But you can configure it to alternate ports if you want to make it just TCP like health check. You can if you want to make it like an HTTP health check, specify response codes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why you'd want to do this. It does seem like it makes it simpler. On the other hand, I can also see the other approach, which is like, hey, there's some, like, if we're going to operate a cluster for somebody, there's some stuff we need to know. Like, we need to be able to skim the metrics. We need to be able to check for health, right? We need to, I don't know, maybe we need a management webhook or something like, right? There's some things that we need to do. And so you're in a situation where like you're promising something about the cluster, but the cluster admin or the user is also got to make some return promises, like if you're going to work together. So from that perspective, if somebody does delete the public info viewer role or whatever, like they kind of broke something about their cluster, and maybe they want to know that. I don't know. That's kind of my feeling. I could honestly go either way. Yeah.
I would rather not take on maintenance of an additional alternate chain, especially when there are alternatives.
Yeah. I wonder if we could make the user experience better by providing another name for the public info viewer role. Like, what if we called it health checker, or like load balancer, like the control plane load balancer provider or something like that.
That seems reasonable.
I think people like, I would have this instinct too. People look at their cluster and they see public info viewer, like, I don't want any public anything viewing info about my cluster. I'm going to get rid of that thing. But if you look at it and it says like, hey, this thing is making your load balancer work, like people are like, okay, well, maybe I need that.
I guess in a managed environment, though, do you want to give someone the ability to not make their managed like load balancer work?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we have not this exact problem in my cloud environment, but very, very similar ones. And like, yeah, people can delete the robot account or whatever, and it's annoying. And we've slowly added things to make it better. Yeah, I mean,
I do agree.
I think it's kind of good for people to understand what parts of the system the provider is managing for them, and the fact that there's like a security account is really kind of it's almost a contract between the consumer of the service and the provider of the service, right? Like you're saying, I need this account to do the thing that I'm doing for you, and the user gets to understand like, oh, hey, you've got this account and you can do the things that this account says you can do, and you're not going to do the things that the account says you can't do. So from that perspective, I think it's kind of useful to have that boundary, at least like just helping customers understand what parts of the system you're doing for them and what parts you're not. I can see people wanting to make different choices though.
Yeah, I do agree that like, a different, role or, like a different role or role binding name would help. The customer who sees public info viewer is like, I don't want any public info viewed by anyone, right? Like the naming helps with the perception, but is it, I guess, like the difference here with like I guess with the proposal of an alternate port would be, I'm not, I as the provider, I'm not going to make that port public at all. It's not about even it being public. It's about like just operating like the server.
Yeah.
And I do get like the contract side, like, and I do think like the robot account contract side of things, like that totally makes sense if I want to prevent, we're talking about access controls to data in my cluster, but I guess on a more, like if you're talking about fundamentally just operating the thing so that anyone can access it, whether that's the provider or the customer. Like that's kind of where I'm thinking. Like, to me, the motivations as just like an operator of the cluster makes sense to have a separate port. But
Yeah,
again,
are you using the insecure port right now for this?
No, we are using the like secure port.
Oh, I see.
But yeah, I mean, you can lock yourself out of the box, which requires like operator intervention to go unlock the box.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. We have taken some rather extreme measures to keep people from locking themselves out with webhooks and webhooks especially. Yeah, I don't know. Does that move you at all, David?
So can I ask a question related to this? I know we are talking about ports, and I will admit I have not thought this through exactly, but would a flag that makes it so that healthz is available no matter what, like even if like you are always somehow authenticated if you try to hit /healthz, and you're also authorized. Sure.
Okay. I guess I like that even less. Just because it defies expectation. I do appreciate, like, as a user, I'd be pissed. If the solution was hard, like if it were actually hard to go and say like, hey, use this kubeconfig and on this port expose an HTTP server reflecting readyz, I would feel a lot differently, right? Like if that were hard to do, but it's not, and it keeps everything completely separate.
I don't know if I understand what you're saying. You're saying you put this into proxy, like some sort of proxy?
We just run a separate server, right? Like in order to support that GCP load balancer, we just run a separate server that can connect to readyz, and it exposes readyz only on.
How does that server have permission to talk to readyz?
Well, we support anonymous auth. If you choose not to support anonymous auth, you could pass a kubeconfig, right? It would do it. You still have to give it an account. That robot account, which has that power.
Yeah, you still have to give it an account. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's the same robot account that has the power to scrape metrics and to do metrics for us, right? So it's not hard to write and keep completely separate, so that we never.
But the user could still like delete the robot account or block it or stop remove the rule that gives it permission, right? Yeah. So that doesn't actually solve the problem here.
So I mean,
and also
sorry, I was just going to say, if in the managed provider case, like sort of the way I would expect someone to do this, and it's a lot of work, but sure, whatever. Like if we talk about EKS specifically, is they would not use like a service account. They would use an AWS identity that is backed by their own authenticator that you can't turn off. And they would also authorize it using their own webhook that you also can't turn off. And then there's no way to lock them out. They would always have access because their authorizer would always say they have access, and their authenticator would always say that this proxy is authenticated. Sorry, not the proxy, but this load balancer, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a lot of work in that sense, but that one is fully guaranteed unbreakable because it's all just CLI flag based. There's nothing in the managed provider case that you can do to break that.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems like that seems like a better solution. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying that managing another server for like healthz would also become an overhead to operate and like manage in a long term.
It's not realistically a significant one, right? Like it's a server with nearly static config. We do this for every OpenShift cluster in existence. It's not on their hardware.
I'm-
Like it's not hard.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that. I mean, like you are already managing like a bunch of things. Then one more needs to be managed, whether you just editing a Golang or like if you have just written the Golang, updating a SDK or like anything, it's just an overhead from my understanding.
Yeah. Like part of the reason SIG-AUTH
Yeah.
asked us to remove this is because the HTTP port has had distinct bugs, and it's had CVEs that are worse in their grading because of its present.
Yeah, it's a pretty dangerous thing. You're one exploit away from having a big problem. But I want to go back to Mo's proposed solution, which is just use the authorizer and authentication webhooks to make sure that you're always authenticated and authorized. That actually doesn't sound too bad to me. And that gives a property which I like, which is that you know you're going through the whole stack and nothing is broken, right? Like you could imagine like if people are relying on some part of the stack and the health checking code doesn't exercise that, then you could think it's healthy when it's actually not.
I guess it also guarantees you're able to fix your system, which is good.
Yeah. Micah, does
One question. Sorry, one
ahead.
question I had on the like a different port when we are talking like just for the healthz. So how would the I mean like I don't understand fully, and that's why I'm asking like how would like so today the OK status comes from a different components or different controllers of like APIServer as well as like etcd. So in that case, are we saying that we will basically implement all of that if it is a different port to communicate? How would the access you allow from two different port to the other components, whether you're like it depends on like how configuration settings are, but like we allow from basically inbound from only from this port from this that like my inbound rules. So we will have to basically apply different ports always.
I think it'd be up to the provider to determine the access control to that whatever's talking authenticated and authorized to healthz, right? That's kind of the proposal, or that's kind of what we're talking about now. It's just saying the whoever controls the API server also controls access to this proxy healthz checker.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think
does that,
I get that. I think
work for you, or
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think like not having implemented an authorizing webhook today and like I guess just thinking out loud, like you could if you even if you weren't EKS, if you were COPS or if you were someone else, right? Like you'd have to do the same thing. You just have to implement it yourself, whether that's like add a certificate authority that's unique to that machine to the trusted CA list and have a system master's identity so that it doesn't get like it can't get revoked via RBAC, and like you're saying, David, like give it a kubeconfig that uses that to talk to the API server or something.
I'd even be willing to help write or provide right? Like that is something very self-contained. It's separate from the API server. It eliminates some of the concerns that are leading to us removing the HTTP port. If that would help make it easier to like make a transition, I'm happy to open a PR to make that server run.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if there were, the other thing I'm just thinking here is there's fragmentation, right? Like everyone could do it their own way, which is there's flexibility, but like if there was even just a simple, like you're saying, like a minimal implementation, reference implementation to say, here's how you can have a proxy sidecar to proxy healthz that's authenticated and authorized or whatever. I think that would work.
All right. we're 22 minutes in. I think we should go on to our next topic, if that's okay. Thanks for the discussion, everyone.
Yep, thank you.
I'm glad we came up with something that seems like it might be okay. Okay, Scott, do you want to talk to us about CRD custom sub-resources?
Yeah, howdy. So I made a little presentation. I don't know if you want to go through it now or if you've already looked at it, but
I think I looked at it. I don't know if you've changed it since then.
maybe I can go
but
frame the problem.
yeah, why don't you just present it and then we can talk after that.
If I can find it. There we go. Okay. If you don't know who I am Scott Nichols. I work on the Knative project right now, and we've been doing a lot of pioneering in the world of duck typing inside of Kubernetes for CRDs. We do this to be able to extend our resources and loosely couple the projects and extensions together with without actual concrete API type knowledge. And we do this with a combination of aggregated RBAC and some clever tricks around projections into common schema. So we can do things like, if you look at a Knative serving service, it has the same shape as a deployment minus some bits. And this is intentional because we can treat them as the same object. And so let's talk about let me see if I can, let me know if this still works. Presented full screen. Sweet. Okay, so this is a quick re-education for me to just confirm that I remember all the bits and pieces of the API server. And so this is an API recap around Kubernetes API conventions and extensions and that sort of stuff. So, you know, the API server is very well structured around how resource CRUD is structured, and then the API endpoints that get assembled through the resources. And this applies for both the built-in types and custom resources. And so, you know, I just run through an example, kind of assuming that the viewer of this presentation knows nothing. But I assume this group knows a little bit about the API server. All right, so here's some more examples, like where pieces of the resource get injected into the path. And there's some weird points in the API that we've worked in, like log and proxy, and I'm sure there's others where the thing that you get back from this endpoint is not necessarily any sort of sub-resource of the object, but a whole new resource that's associated to the object.
Yeah, or a completely different protocol entirely. I think of these as like model breaking sub-resources.
Yeah, so I call them non-conformant sub-resources, but I don't really want to talk about this in my talk. My proposal, it doesn't really address the problem of non-conformant sub-resources. I'm more talking about API projections of the top-level resource. And then this presentation goes around and says, like, okay, how do you extend things? Well, you could use a CRD, and where the bits get assembled into the REST paths come from the actual definition. And it has some trivial support for sub-resources, and this lets you do things like RBAC for patching and posting and getting, so that you could maybe expose just your status and not your entire spec to some reader or writer. And this is exactly the use case that I'm trying to get with sub-resources for arbitrary types. And you can see here, there's an example of the conversion API conventions that have been set up. All right, the point of this is that in CRDs, there's two ways to extend the API. There is the explicit versions storage and conversion webhook piece, where the CRD knows explicitly the paths that there's some service running on your cluster somewhere, and it's going to go and invoke some webhook, and it's going to do some other conversion, and the type is going to be like converted to the new type based on the schema that was asked for, but there's a bunch of mechanics in behind the scene that needs to happen to actually make that realized because of storage concerns and things like that. And so CRDs have two different ways of extending that API, and I'm saying that the first way is the conversion webhooks that's baked into the CRD. The second way is validating and mutating webhook configurations, which is late bound after the fact. And it's another webhook that registers in the same way the conversion webhook runs, and it could be the same service, but it has a different responsibility, but it's still doing new things for your API. And then, etc. This is what a mutating webhook configuration looks like. Okay, cool. So that's the newest way that we do this in the API server. There also is, and there has been, the aggregated API server. This is the you got a free puppy way. You don't get storage. You get auth, but that's basically it. And you have to speak the magic protocol that's not super well defined, and it's basically you have to consume the API Machinery starter pack to get this up and running. And there's a registration process that has to happen. And for sake of completeness, I show this is how the registration happens, and then in some Go code, this is how the path gets assembled based on what's actually running. So you can see here the cron tabs example from CRDs. You could do it with the aggregated server in the same way, except now instead of all definitions, it's partial definition, partial Go code running, and there's a handshake process in the beginning. So in my opinion, API server resource, this is for aggregated APIs, seems dated. In comparison to CRDs, it doesn't have the declarative robustness that we kind of expect with Kubernetes today and extensions, because there's this magic bit that has to run and that you can't know what's going to happen until you install it. So I feel like that's a downside of aggregated APIs.
I think it's worth pointing out that Vue isn't universal. And for instance, things like metrics, which use a different storage backend in order to drive your HPAs, would not be successful using CRDs. So just because it doesn't work for you does not mean that the method itself is dated, and does not mean that we would not recommend it for other people to solve their use cases.
Sure. But I'm scoping my problem down to kind of like the normal resources in Kubernetes that are doing API extensions, not necessarily like the metric server that's trying to expose a different API front.
Yeah,
So
I agree that the metrics API server method doesn't work for you, but it is useful for other things.
So my proposed solution is going to key off of what already exists in CRDs, and we allow support for custom sub-resource projections via webhook configuration, bike shed names. In this example, you could continue to get extended new custom sub-resources based on the current way that you would register a webhook today. So the advantage here is that it's late bound, and I as a third-party vendor to some other resource, I could extend and decorate it.
I have a question about this one specifically. You're saying here that I can just randomly declare, well, it's not random to me, but I can declare a sub-resource. I can bring my own projection webhook. I can make it source any type in the system and make its target sub-resource any place in the system. Or I, like disconnected from the CRD type, I can tack on a sub-resource. That's what you're suggesting here.
That's right. I mean, the same RBAC rules apply, and authorization in the cluster still applies. And this webhook that has to be able to go and reach and do something has to be authorized. So there's definitely an auth story that needs to make sure that this isn't a workaround to get access to resources that you're not allowed to see or look at or mutate. But yeah, I am suggesting that any vendor, any implementator could go and extend a cluster and add a new sub-resource to any resource.
Now, I will say that strikes me as a little unusual. We had these things be namespace scoped with a domain with the intention that they would be logically owned by that entity.
Right, but I can add a webhook to anything that I care to in my cluster.
It's true. I mean, the admission webhook validating and mutating ones, the intention there is policy, and the idea is like whoever's setting policy for the cluster gets to set policy over arbitrary types, but whoever is providing a type doesn't necessarily get access to anything special other than just that type.
Yeah, that's exactly the same situation I'm proposing here, except the end result is not defaults and admission, it's projection.
So the downside I see with this is like in your example, there's someone provides cron tabs, and then someone provides this webhook in the progress subresource. And if I'm using this subresource and cron tabs goes from V1 to V2, now I have a problem because my progress webhook may not have updated to the latest, right? So I could update API server and then find myself in a situation where I can't serve the progress subresource because I have a version of the cron tab that isn't compatible with the webhook.
Yeah, in that case, this projection webhook configuration would have a status of I am broken.
Yeah, that would, yeah, that my thought isn't so much that it would be difficult to handle the situation, because like, yeah, we would do that, but it's difficult for somebody to upgrade their cluster, right? It adds another gate to upgrading the cluster.
I'm still interested in continuing on. I just wanted to make note that continuing on doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with everything here.
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is a first pass, and definitely like let's talk about this and see where we could go. Not this is exactly what I would like to use.
Fair.
So
let's keep moving the road.
Okay, so and then I indicate that the existence of that projection webhook could go and do a status update, and you could see in the status of the CRD potentially the sub-resources that have been registered for that particular CRD. So it itself is an aggregate, and it says like, this is what I have available, and it's not necessarily everything that's in the spec, because maybe there's something that's non-conformant, or the version's moved on, or it's incompatible, or whatever, right? Like, but this idea that we add some more status to the CRDs, and says the CRD itself can say, hey, I registered that I can now be served by the status and the progress and the whatever's sub resources. Okay, so that's the late bound version. And
one question about the configuration you described. Did you envision this being allowed to add a sub resource to a built-in Kubernetes type, like deployment, for instance?
I hadn't really thought about that, but I think I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work. But the one gotcha is that there is no way to go and ask the status of like a deployment resource. Like the kind.
You mean the equivalent to the CRD status?
Yeah, exactly. There's no object.
I think you can still figure this information out from the both the homegrown and the Open API spec. So I think you can still discover this.
Yeah, and okay, yeah, I haven't really thought about that, the Open API and what this would do, but yeah, that's right. This would also trickle there too. Yeah. Okay, cool. So then let's see. I'm just saying it's dynamic and late bound. You can also do, I'm also proposing that maybe we could do custom sub-resource projection inside of the sub-resources. We could do an extension, byte shed name. We have projections, and this would be a simple JSON mapping similar to how scale works today. So it's schema maybe needs to be mutated, but there isn't anything complicated there. And this is the,
I don't understand what this slide is telling me.
Sorry, what?
I don't understand what this slide is telling me.
This is the, I have a single custom resource definition for the cron tabs again. So we're starting fresh. I want to add the progress for, and it has a status.percent in its resource status. And I'm saying I would like to project just that field into the status result when I ask for, blah, 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 / progress.
Yeah, I see this as saying from the main resources .status.percent to the progress subresources type .status.percent.
Yeah, you can think of this as like a filter. So you'd get all the metadata around the type, but nothing else that's not projected. So you wouldn't, anything else in the status would be blocked here. All the spec would be blocked. You would just get a status object that has .percent and then the value.
And the idea is that we have some description here that says this is only good for a get, or?
Yeah, that would have to get defined.
Okay.
So would you see this field that's being added in the projection in the open API for the status subresource?
No, you would see it for the progress subresource.
Yeah, that's right.
What would the name of the type be?
Sorry, that's what I meant.
The name
Yeah,
of
that's a good question. Well,
yeah, it's a scale, but I don't see it specified here. That's why I was having trouble understanding what this was telling me.
Oh, well, so
yeah,
this projection sub-resource name is called progress. And so you could see on the other side in status, the computed sub-resources for V1 are status and progress. And so those end up to be CRUD endpoints that we can go and hit.
Oh,
And,
but is it like
so I have.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
Does it end up being like a progress.stable.example.com? Like when you hit scale, it's a scale.autoscaling k.io, right? When you hit status, it's the same object, but what would it be here? What would the actual kind be?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but I'm sure we could make something.
So I think this is actually pretty hard to do. So if you set it up like it is, the kinds are exactly parallel and it's just a filter, then you actually don't need a from to, you just need like a list of fields that are permitted to go through the filter, right? And it's fine to do writes in one place and propagate them back the other way. If you want to include renaming, then you can also kind of do what you're doing here. If you want to do any moving, then it gets very confusing, because what if you try to move something out of a field that's in a list? When we talked about, I forget what the context was. Maybe it was the conversion webhooks. We had a bunch of thoughts on, I'm pretty sure it was the conversion webhooks, and we were originally going to permit like field moves and stuff between versions, but eventually we decided that the sorts of things that people wanted to do to enable each one just required a huge amount of thought to make sure that the API made sense, and to make it understandable to people. Like, as you can see from David's question, this API isn't immediately understandable, which isn't a dig on the API. Like the actual thing you're trying to do is really complicated. So that's kind of why we were like, okay, it's just provide a webhook to do it.
Yeah, personally for me, a webhook is more understandable, and I can actually understand that code and write it and produce it. And in that case, the webhook could define what the type that comes out of it is supposed to be. And it might be just like there's a new metadata filter flag that says this has been projected, and it might not represent the whole thing. Right? When you get status, you get the status of the object with the original kind, but the spec is missing. This would be the same idea. Okay, anyway, so I think, anyway, I'm not just, right, for discussion, I don't know. And that's the presentation. So the hostage situation is you could implement all of this thing by, I could make a conversion webhook and do some very silly type lookup stuff and actually like host a conversion that has no stored type that you can access. So you always have to go through conversion, and then through some name lookup, I can find the real kind you're looking for. And I would get the same result with the projection webhooks. But I don't really want to do that. I'd like an official way. So
Daniel, you're on mute. I can see your mouth moving.
So you can imagine today you set up a version with a special name, and you've got like one place where you stash all the fields that you don't want the user to mess with, and like then the place where the user sees, you put the fields in the order you want them to see. So the only difference with a projection webhook is we wouldn't require it to round trip, so you don't have to store the fields that you don't want the user to be able to change, and it would go to a different place in the URL path. So it's actually not too different from the conversion webhook as I see it. So the place where it gets strange is when you're registering this webhook separately from the CRD object itself. I can understand why you want to do that, but that's a little unusual. I think it'd be more obvious to put it in the CRD with the conversion webhooks that are already there.
So
that would also eliminate concerns about who owns what, right? Like if you own your CRD, you own the definition of these sub-resources.
Right, but the goal here is around being able to use controllers and operators and whatever you want to call them to be able to do things that are that again, like being able to assemble things that are loosely coupled, but they're not aware of the actual kind. It's using aggregated APIs and maybe some magic labels or another resource to point to a set of kinds that adhere to some behavior that we would like to stitch together. If people would like a concrete use case, I could give one.
So I think there's some other considerations, which is if the projection webhook is a separate resource completely, we would have to make the targets, like it'd have to be acceptable for you to go hook onto a built-in or an aggregated API. And those two have super different request paths, so it would be challenging. If your primary need is for CRDs, like if the sections in the CRD, the custom resource definition, were sufficiently separate, I can imagine you providing a manifest that somebody could apply over their existing CRD to add on your webhook, right? Like if the system administrator agrees that yes, this is what they want to do. So I think you could get that functionality you're looking for, even if this is stored in the custom resource definition.
And that would be fine with me. The other benefit of having it in the CRD, or at least some object in the cluster, is that I can go and query for things that also implement that custom sub resource with some schema. The schema would be important, and I could say for everything that implements the progress sub resource, I would like to show the progress of their whatever they're doing. And I don't need to know their kind. I hook up to the right aggregated role, and I can now show some really rich data around what's happening in my cluster without knowing.
You would be able to do that by going through either the open API or the custom discovery information. Yeah, if you wanted to do that stuff. But for that to work, you would want the kind that David mentioned. You'd want to make sure that everybody implementing the same thing used the same name for their kind. Yeah, which is a detail that was missing from the
Yeah, let me
the
think
slides
about that
earlier.
one. So, okay, sorry, we're running out of time. So the next step is a KEP, or should I write another paper, or like what should I do now? What's next?
I think, I don't know that we have achieved consensus on whether we think it's a good idea to, like, no matter where this lives, would we recommend that an agent that did not own the API itself add a projection onto it? I think that's like one set of things to decide on. I didn't see an exploration of how
Sorry, David, let me interrupt for a second. I don't know that we have to agree on that. Like if we add it to the CRD resource, I think that's a clear implication from our part about who should be setting that. But if people want to compose CRDs from multiple sources, like I think they should be able to do that.
It would. So here's a bad idea. What if the conversion was an extension and you actually converted to another CRD?
I'm not trying to suggest that like you do this in terms of conversions. I'm not trying to say that. What I just want to, I'm not comfortable with saying to people like, you know, one agent controls the CRD definition and a different agent is attaching sub-resources to it. I'm not comfortable recommending, at this moment in time, I'm not comfortable recommending that someone do that. I'm also not clear on which endpoints currently exist inside of our Kube API that would be satisfied by this, right? Would it be a replacement for something like pods binding? And that one's notable because it's very frequent. It was one of the very first ones that we created. It is a projection of certain fields, but it's notable because it was exposed with a different set of access controls and has a different set of validation rules associated with it, which actually gives a pretty tremendous amount of power, right? You can say no one can change this field in spec except someone who has permission to touch this. And I'd be interested in knowing whether and how this would try to address that need, because it does seem like a pretty substantial one that still falls naturally into a CRUD projection mechanism.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a good point. I would expect this to handle the pods binding, and the point about differential validation seems like a really good one. So I think I'm going to suggest that the next step is to like write up a more detailed design doc, maybe. I think something along these lines can work. So it might be time for a more detailed design. Does that sound right, David?
It does, and I think I would like that design to focus on how we would modify the CRD resource, unless you find something that can't exist in part of the CRD resource, and then I'd want that very explicitly described, because that would be a way where I could look at it and say like, okay, it's in the CRD resource. If someone tries to compose it from two spots, I can't stop them because I can't stop them today, but the ownership signal there is fairly strong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'd like to see a design that's focused on adding this projection type webhook to the CRD resource API, the CRD API.
Okay, sounds good. I'll try to draft something up, and maybe next time or the next time after that.
All right. Thank you very much for writing up such detail and coming to tell us about it. I've definitely that's a great level of detail and an example for other people to emulate when they have ideas for us. So thanks for that. Let's see, the next topic, I think, unless Fede has joined and he's here, he wanted us to know that the 1 point
dates moved.
Yeah, wanted to let us know the dates have moved. So I'm reading this email for the first time right now, and sounds like docs has gone up to the 19th, which I guess is the end of this week. Code freeze is July 9th now. Cherry pick deadline is August 6th. And August 25 is when we're going to release v 1.19. So we've got more time. The way 2020 is going, we might need even more, but it's good to have some. And we have 8 minutes left, and I see Ken has suggested that we discuss something, but I don't know exactly what.
Yeah.
Ken, is this a 8-minute topic?
Yeah, I think so. I hope we get started, and I understand the constraints now 7. So with the release of 118, there was constraints put in place around validation, in particular around X Kubernetes map type. And as we start to see people using Operator SDK and Kube Builder, when they use types that are out of the core, validation fails. And it fails because the core types do not define defaults. Many, maybe apps, maybe most or all, I don't know, of the core types the definition of core defaults are part of comments and not really defined as part of a specification. So it seems like the right place to fix this would be to have defaults in the core. And it seems like perhaps we need a KEP to manage that. I know that some of the defaults are, how do you say that? They're dependent upon multiple sources as opposed to one definition that is easily defined. So with that, I just wanted to open up, make sure that there was awareness, and mostly I was interested is there effort underway that I should be aware of that I could hook into?
So I would say this sounds like a great topic for the API expression working group. I'd also say I think our intention, or at least my intention, was if a static default is possible, it should be programmatically propagated from some sort of commentary or tag in our comments. Should be propagated into the Open API spec. Yeah, so we should do that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I think we discussed that topic once or twice at the API expression meeting, and it's something we should talk about.
I have a
okay,
question.
I'll redirect to that. Thanks. Sorry, David.
I'm interested in intent.
Let's see. Hold on, David.
Yeah, I'm interested in intent when you are encapsulating these types from core. Is it your intent to try to run and build like all the defaults out and store those defaults in your API? Or is it more like you want to ferry a pod spec from A to B? And when you actually fluffed up that pod, that would be the time where you want the defaults realized for the current default settings for a pod.
Yeah, so I'm one of the maintainers of the libraries that are being used, and I don't always know the exact use cases, but the ones that I've been exposed to, they are generally using something like container, like they're defining an init container for their CRD, something along those lines. They literally may not need all the defaults, to be honest. What happens is they are generating a CRD off of a defined Go structure, and the CRD that gets created is not valid by default. So it fails in just trying to say, apply CRD to the Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if that is actually an indication that the type that they are using looks a lot like a container, but doesn't have the same validation requirements as a container, since at least when we did this for, say, workload types, we actually want in OpenShift, we skew, right? It's not always the same OpenShift API server that maps to a Q API server, so things like a container definition change over time. And we actually want current defaults to be applied, not the defaults that happened to be in use when we froze the object. So what we realized is that our type is schematically very similar, but it is not the same.
Yeah, I have, we've got like a couple minutes left. Let me just say, we feel pretty strongly that the API server should be the thing applying the defaults. So we would not be exposing the defaults with the intention that users apply them themselves to the object. Especially not if it's something that's going to be stored and then submitted at a later time. We would not want people to do that.
Yeah. But I agree, API expression seems like a good spot. And in general, the spots where we can actually correct what we have makes a lot of sense.
Yep. All right. So let's take that topic up there if there's more questions. And I think we should call it a day. Thanks everybody for joining.